Billionaire woman slap and humiliated judge in court. His sentence leaves everyone stunned. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the air conditioning system struggled against the oppressive heat of a summer afternoon. A hush fell over the gathered crowd as Vivian Steele, a towering figure in the world of luxury tech, strode confidently into the courtroom. Her power suit, impeccably tailored in deep navy, made her seem more like she was heading into a shareholders meeting than a legal battleground. Her designer stilettos clicked sharply against the polished floor, each step a statement of defiance. Judge Kenneth Rowe, a man known for his no-nonsense demeanor and commitment to impartiality, watched her approach from the bench. He had presided over hundreds of cases, but something about today felt different. The whispers and murmurs in the gallery suggested this wasn't just another lawsuit. This was a showdown between wealth, privilege, and the rule of law. As the trial commenced, the prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. Steele was accused of orchestrating an elaborate scheme to silence a whistleblower who had exposed her company's unethical practices. But when the first witness took the stand, it wasn't the testimony that captivated the room. It was Steele's reaction, a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed through the courtroom. "Are we seriously going to entertain this circus act?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. The judge's gavel slammed down, reverberating like thunder. "Miss Steele, this is a court of law, not your boardroom," Judge Rowe declared, his voice cutting through the tension. "You will respect these proceedings, or I will hold you in contempt." Steele smirked, unrepentant. "Respect? Let's see if your verdict earns it." It was a bold move, one that left the courtroom buzzing. Little did Steele know, Judge Rowe's response would make headlines for years to come. The courtroom's energy shifted as the first day of the trial rolled into its second hour. The prosecution methodically presented their evidence, a series of damning emails, and financial records that painted Vivian Steele's company as a juggernaut of greed and corruption. Yet, the real drama was unfolding on the defense's side of the room. Steele sat unflinching, her piercing gaze locked on the prosecutor. Her lips curled in a faint smirk, as though she were amused by the entire proceeding. "This document," the prosecutor said, holding up a printed email exchange, "is proof that Ms. Steele personally authorized the transfer of funds to a shell company designed to cover up illegal activities. The whistleblower's testimony corroborates this." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Steele's lead attorney, Miles Grayson, stood to object. His polished tone and silver-tongued rhetoric had earned him a reputation as a master of dismantling prosecution arguments. "Your Honor, the document's authenticity is highly questionable," he said. "We have evidence suggesting these emails were doctored." Judge Rowe raised a hand, signaling both sides to pause. He turned his sharp eyes towards Steele. "Miss Steele, do you have anything to say before I decide on the admissibility of this evidence?" Vivian Steele leaned forward, her confidence radiating like a heat wave. "Only that it's pathetic to see my competitors resort to such desperate measures. They'll do anything to see me fall." The gallery erupted in whispers, a mix of awe and disbelief. Judge Rowe's gavel brought order once more. "Miss Steele, this is your final warning. Treat this court with respect." Despite the judge's admonition, Steele's calm remained unshaken. It was as if she were playing a game no one else understood, and she believed herself invincible. The next witness was called, Alan Price, the whistleblower whose revelations had brought Steele's empire to the brink of collapse. Price walked to the stand with the wary demeanor of a man who knew he was risking everything. He had been a mid-level executive at Steele Industries before he discovered the discrepancies that led to his exposing the truth. As he recounted the events leading to his decision to blow the whistle, his voice quivered but grew steadier with each word. "I found invoices that didn't add up," Price testified. "Millions of dollars were being funneled to accounts that had no clear connection to our operations. When I brought it up, I was told to let it go. That's when I started digging deeper." Steele's smirk faded for the first time as Price's testimony continued. Her attorneys furiously scribbled notes, and for a fleeting moment, her mask of confidence slipped, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. Grayson seized the opportunity to cross-examine. "Mr. Price, isn't it true you were passed over for a promotion shortly before you came forward with these allegations?" he asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. Price's jaw tightened. "Yes, but that has nothing to do with—" Grayson cut him off. "And isn't it also true that you were reprimanded for poor performance reviews in the months leading up to your so-called discovery?" The tension in the room was electric. Price's composure cracked, and he shot back. "My performance reviews were fine until I started asking questions about the missing money." Judge Rowe intervened. "Mr. Grayson, the witness has answered your question. Let's move on." As Price stepped down, Steele's confidence appeared to return, but the cracks in her armor were becoming evident. She whispered something to Grayson, who nodded and rose to address the court. "Your Honor, we request a recess to review these new claims." Judge Rowe, after a moment's consideration, agreed. "Court is adjourned for the day. We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. As the courtroom emptied, Steele lingered for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the room. Her smirk returned, but it no longer seemed as unshakable. Tomorrow, the stakes would climb higher, and the battle for control of the narrative would intensify. For now, the storm's eye had passed, but the hurricane was far from over. The courtroom was silent as Judge Rowe called the court back into session the next morning. Vivian Steele entered with the same confidence, but the weight of the accusation seemed to press down on the room. Her smirk was still there, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. The first confrontation began as the prosecutor introduced a bombshell witness, Claire Donovan, a former executive assistant to Steele. Claire's nervousness was palpable as she took the stand, her hands trembling as she adjusted the microphone. Steele's expression hardened at the sight of her, a subtle tightening of her jaw that didn't go unnoticed by the gallery. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Ms. Donovan, you worked closely with Ms. Steele for 5 years, correct?" "Yes," Claire replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "During that time, were you ever asked to perform tasks that you felt were unethical or illegal?" A sharp intake of breath rippled through the courtroom. Claire hesitated, her eyes darting to Steele, who stared back with a chilling intensity. Finally, Claire nodded. "Yes." The room erupted in whispers, but Judge Rowe's gavel quickly restored order. "Ms. Donovan," the prosecutor continued, "can you elaborate on one such instance?" Claire took a deep breath, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I was instructed to shred documents that linked Steele Industries to off-the-books accounts. When I questioned it, Ms. Steele told me it was standard practice to protect proprietary information." Steele's attorney, Miles Grayson, immediately objected. "Hearsay and conjecture, Your Honor. This testimony is unsubstantiated." Judge Rowe turned to the prosecutor. "Do you have corroborating evidence to support this testimony?" "We do, Your Honor," the prosecutor replied, presenting a series of emails. "These emails detail the instructions sent from Ms. Steele's account to Ms. Donovan, explicitly referencing the destruction of these documents." Grayson rose again, his voice sharp. "Your Honor, these emails could have been sent by anyone with access to Ms. Steele's account. There is no definitive proof that she authored them." Judge Rowe nodded thoughtfully. "The court will consider this." "Continue." The prosecutor pressed on. "Ms. Donovan, how did you feel when you were given these instructions?" "I felt trapped," Claire admitted, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to lose my job, but I knew what I was doing was wrong." Steele finally spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. "This is absurd," she said, standing up. "Ms. Donovan is a disgruntled former employee looking for attention. This court is wasting its time." Judge Rowe's gavel slammed down. "Ms. Steele, sit down or I will hold you in contempt." The room was electric, the tension nearly unbearable. Steele slowly sat, her eyes never leaving Claire. The confrontation had left its mark, the first crack in Steele's formidable facade. But the battle was far from over. The courtroom was buzzing as the tension from the first confrontation spilled into the following days. Vivian Steele's calculated defiance had been shaken, and the prosecution was ready to capitalize on every crack in her armor. Judge Rowe, maintaining his stern and impartial demeanor, reminded the jury to keep an open mind. Yet the dramatic developments made it clear, this trial was no ordinary battle of justice. The prosecution shifted gears, introducing a key piece of evidence, a ledger containing coded entries allegedly tied to Steele Industries' off-the-books accounts. Forensic accountant Renee Carter took the stand to walk the court through her findings. Her calm, professional demeanor provided a stark contrast to the simmering tension in the defense's corner. Each of these entries correlates to payments made to shell companies, Carter explained, pointing to a detailed chart displayed on a screen. These payments were then funneled back into accounts controlled by Steele Industries, a clear violation of corporate finance laws. Miles Grayson launched his counterattack. Ms. Carter, is it possible that these transactions were misinterpreted? Steele Industries operates globally. Couldn't these simply be payments to international contractors? Carter didn't flinch. Not when the shell companies are registered under false names and dissolved shortly after the transactions. That's not standard business practice, Mr. Grayson. The gallery murmured in approval. Steele, seated at the defense table, scribbled furious notes, while whispering to Grayson. Her confidence seemed more performative now, her smirk no longer reaching her eyes. The tension climbed further when the prosecution called another witness, Nadia Flores, a former operations manager who had worked under Steele's leadership. Nadia had a reputation for being fiercely loyal to Steele, but her sudden departure from the company 2 years earlier had fueled speculation. Today, she took the stand with a measured resolve. Ms. Flores, the prosecutor began. You worked closely with Ms. Steele on major projects. Can you describe the company culture during your tenure? Nadia hesitated, glancing briefly at Steele, who stared back with an icy calm. The culture was results-driven, she said carefully. But it was also intimidating. Employees were often pushed to prioritize the company's interests over ethical considerations. Can you give an example? The prosecutor asked. There was a project where we were asked to bypass environmental regulations, Nadia replied. When I raised concerns, I was told by Ms. Steele directly that rules are for people who don't have vision. Gasps echoed through the gallery. Grayson immediately objected, calling the statement hearsay, but Judge Rowe allowed the testimony to stand. Under cross-examination, Grayson attempted to discredit Nadia's testimony. Ms. Flores, isn't it true that you left Steele Industries after a disagreement over your promotion? Yes, but that doesn't change the facts of what I witnessed. Nadia shot back, her voice steady. Isn't it also true that you have since started working for a competitor of Steele Industries? Grayson pressed, his tone accusatory. I have, Nadia admitted. But that's irrelevant to the unethical practices I observed during my time there. The prosecutor followed up with a final question. Ms. Flores, why did you decide to come forward now? Nadia's voice wavered but didn't break. Because I believe the truth matters, no matter how powerful the person you're standing against might be. The rising action reached a boiling point when the prosecution introduced the final piece of evidence, a recording secretly made by Alan Price, the whistleblower. The recording captured Steele in a private meeting, instructing senior executives to neutralize the fallout from the whistleblower's initial report. Steele's voice, cold and commanding, filled the courtroom. Handle this quietly, she said in the recording. We can't afford to let some self-righteous employee derail everything we've built. Do what you need to do. The jury's eyes widened as they heard her words. Steele's face hardened into an expressionless mask, but the tension in her clenched fists betrayed her. Grayson sprang to his feet. Your Honor, this recording was obtained without consent. It's inadmissible. Judge Rowe's stern gaze fell on the defense attorney. Mr. Grayson, the court will determine the admissibility of evidence. Sit down. The prosecutor seized the moment. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this recording speaks for itself. It reveals a pattern of behavior that undermines the integrity of Ms. Steele's defense. The defense scrambled to regain control, requesting an immediate recess to review the evidence. As the court adjourned, Steele's composed facade cracked further. She lingered for a moment, her gaze locked on the jury as if trying to gauge their reaction. For the first time, the stakes felt insurmountable, even for someone of her stature. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. Steele ignored them, her usual biting remark replaced by silence. The cracks in her seemingly impenetrable shield were widening, and the battle for her future was reaching a fever pitch. The rising action had transformed the trial into a high-stakes spectacle, each revelation amplifying the tension and drawing sharper lines between guilt and innocence. With every passing moment, the truth, and Steele's fate, came closer to being revealed. The courtroom was charged with anticipation as the final day of testimony began. The prosecution had one last ace up their sleeve, and the defense knew it. Vivian Steele, usually unshaken, sat stiffly, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. The air felt heavy, every creak of the wooden benches amplifying the tension. The prosecutor approached the bench with a confident stride. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd like to introduce a key witness whose identity has been kept confidential for their safety." Judge Rowe nodded, signaling the bailiff to open the side door. A collective gasp swept through the room as the witness entered. It was Kevin Miles, Steele's former CFO and a man who had vanished from public view shortly after the scandal broke. Vivian's eyes widened, and for the first time during the trial, she looked genuinely alarmed. Her attorney leaned in to whisper urgently, but Steele didn't respond. Her gaze was locked on Kevin as he took the stand. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Mr. Miles, you worked alongside Ms. Steele for over a decade. Can you explain why you left Steele Industries so abruptly?" Kevin's voice was steady but tinged with regret. "I left because I couldn't be complicit any longer. I knew about the off-the-books accounts, the illegal dealings, and the whistleblower suppression tactics. And I knew they all led back to Ms. Steele." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Judge Rowe's gavel struck sharply, silencing the crowd. "Do you have evidence to support these claims?" the prosecutor asked. Kevin nodded and handed over a flash drive. "This contains financial records, internal memos, and recordings that detail the entire operation. I kept copies as insurance in case anything happened to me." As the evidence was displayed on the courtroom screens, it became clear that the documents left no room for ambiguity. Vivian Steele had orchestrated every illegal maneuver with meticulous precision. Her cold voice filled the courtroom again as another recording played, this one from a private strategy meeting. "If they try to come for us, we'll bury them in red tape and lawsuits," Steele's voice said. "Nobody is untouchable, and that includes whistleblowers." The jury's faces hardened as they watched. Steele's mask of composure shattered. She leaned over to her attorney, her whispers frantic, but the damage was done. Kevin's testimony and the damning evidence had pulled back the curtain on her empire, exposing its rotten foundation. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as the prosecution rested its case. The reveal was complete, and the weight of the truth hung heavy in the air. Steele's invincibility had been a mirage, and the verdict now seemed inevitable. The verdict was read aloud to a courtroom that held its collective breath. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Vivian Steele, guilty on all counts." A flurry of emotions rippled through the room. Some murmured approval, others gasped in disbelief. Vivian Steele sat frozen, her expression inscrutable, though her fingers trembled as she gripped the edge of the defense table. Her attorney, Miles Grayson, leaned in, his face lined with exhaustion. "We'll appeal," he whispered, but the words lacked conviction. Judge Rowe wasted no time in addressing the courtroom. "This case has been a stark reminder that no individual, no matter how wealthy or powerful, is above the law. Ms. Steele, your actions have not only harmed individuals who sought to do the right thing but also eroded trust in institutions that rely on integrity. Sentencing will be held next week." As the judge exited, the room exploded into activity. Reporters swarmed outside the courthouse, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony of shouted questions and flashing cameras. Steele was escorted out by security, her head held high, but the cracks in her composure were evident to those paying close attention. She didn't speak, her silence in armor against the barrage of accusations and inquiries. Inside the courtroom, Kevin Miles stood surrounded by a few reporters and supporters. For the first time in years, he looked unburdened. "Coming forward wasn't easy," he said to one journalist. But I couldn't live with myself knowing what I knew. The truth needed to come out, no matter the cost. Alan Price, the whistleblower who had initiated the case, was similarly reflective as he spoke to a small group of advocates. It's a victory, he admitted, but it came at a price. I lost my job, my friends, and my peace of mind. Still, knowing that justice was served makes it worth it. The impact of the trial extended far beyond the courtroom. Steel Industries' stock plummeted as investors scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. The company's board of directors announced an emergency restructuring, and rumors swirled that bankruptcy might be inevitable. Employees, once fiercely loyal to Steel, began sharing their own stories of toxic workplace culture and unethical practices. The once unassailable empire Vivian Steele had built was crumbling, piece by piece. Meanwhile, advocacy groups celebrated the case as a landmark moment in corporate accountability. This trial sends a clear message, said Nadia Flores, who had testified against Steele. People in power can no longer hide behind wealth and influence. We've proven that the truth can prevail, even when the odds seem impossible. For Judge Rowe, the trial's outcome was a reminder of why he had chosen a life in the judiciary. In chambers, he reflected quietly, knowing this case would be cited for years to come. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a moral one, a pushback against systemic abuse by the privileged. As for Vivian Steele, the fallout was swift and merciless. Her assets were frozen pending further investigations, and multiple civil lawsuits loomed on the horizon. Public opinion turned sharply against her, and even her staunchest defenders began to distance themselves. Steele retreated from public view, her once dominating presence reduced to a cautionary tale of unchecked ambition and arrogance. In the weeks that followed, Alan Price found a new position with a nonprofit organization dedicated to corporate transparency. Kevin Miles received offers to consult on ethics reforms, his role in exposing corruption earning him a measure of redemption. Nadia Flores became a vocal advocate for employee rights, using her platform to push for greater protections for whistleblowers. Though the courtroom battle was over, the ripple effects continued to shape conversations about ethics, power, and accountability. For those who had fought for the truth, the consequences were a bittersweet reminder of the costs of justice, and the enduring importance of standing up against wrongdoing, no matter how daunting the fight. In the quiet aftermath of the courtroom spectacle, a sense of reflection settled over all who had been involved. For Vivian Steele, now confined to house arrest pending her sentencing, the once glittering world of power and control had grown eerily silent. Alone in her sprawling mansion, she wandered through rooms filled with symbols of her success, each object a reminder of what she had lost. One evening, Steele sat in her private study, the mahogany desk cluttered with legal documents and unread letters from former allies now distancing themselves. Her eyes fell on a framed photo of her younger self at her company's groundbreaking ceremony. The ambition in her gaze then was unmistakable, but as she stared at her reflection now, it was clear how much that ambition had twisted over time. She reached for a notepad and pen, tools she hadn't touched in years, and began to write. It wasn't a legal defense or a strategy memo but a letter to herself. Somewhere along the way, she wrote, I convinced myself that success justified anything. I ignored the voices of those who challenged me because I was too blinded by my opinion. I thought I was untouchable, but I see now that power without accountability is a fragile illusion. For Alan Price, the whistleblower who had risked everything to expose the truth, the learning moment was different. Sitting in a modest new office at the nonprofit organization that had hired him, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The fight had been exhausting and lonely, but it had also reaffirmed his belief in doing the right thing, no matter the cost. Speaking at a panel on corporate ethics, Alan shared his insights. What I've learned is that integrity isn't something you can switch on when it's convenient. It has to guide you every step of the way, even when it feels like you're standing alone. The hardest battles are often the most important, and the truth has a way of cutting through the noise, even if it takes time. For Nadia Flores, who had found a new purpose as an advocate for whistleblower protections, the trial was a turning point in understanding her strength. "I used to think that going against the tide was reckless," she said during a televised interview. "But I've realized that sometimes the tide needs to change. Speaking out wasn't easy, but it was necessary. It's a lesson I'll carry forward. Courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it." Even Judge Rowe found himself reflecting on the trial's broader implications. In chambers, he discussed with his clerk the importance of maintaining impartiality in the face of public pressure. "Justice is about balance," he said. "This case reminded me that the law is not just a set of rules, it's a promise to hold everyone accountable, no matter their status." The learning moments varied for each person involved, but they shared a common thread: the recognition that power must be tempered by responsibility, and that truth and integrity are worth the fight, no matter how steep the cost. As the courtroom saga faded into the annals of public memory, its impact continued to ripple across lives and industries. Vivian Steele, once the epitome of unshakable power, was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. Her final public appearance, as she was led away in handcuffs, was devoid of the bravado that once defined her. She remained silent, her face a study in regret, yet the stoic resolve in her eyes hinted at an acknowledgement of her downfall. Steel Industries, her empire, had collapsed under the weight of the revelations. But in its ashes, a new wave of reform emerged. Corporate accountability initiatives were fast-tracked, and whistleblower protection laws were strengthened, sparking hope for a fairer system. Advocacy groups hailed the trial as a turning point, a rare moment when justice prevailed against overwhelming privilege. For Alan Price, the whistleblower, the resolution was bittersweet. He had regained a sense of purpose but carried scars from the battle, both personal and professional. Still, as he stood before a group of aspiring ethics officers at a seminar, he spoke with conviction. "The fight for truth is never easy, but it's always worth it. If one voice can make a difference, imagine what we can do together." Nadia Flores continued her advocacy, transforming her testimony into a platform for change. She spearheaded campaigns to empower employees and ensure that corporate hierarchies could no longer stifle justice. "This is only the beginning," she often said, her voice a rallying cry for a movement that grew stronger by the day. The case of Vivian Steele became a symbol, a stark reminder that no one is above the law. For those who dared to stand against corruption, it was a victory. For everyone watching, it was a call to never let power go unchecked again.